The meeting is now live on Facebook. I get anxious before that little thing says that we're live, whether or not we're actually going to connect. Is it going to work? It always does work. Hi, everybody at the What's on an Elephant and Castle Facebook page. I'm Nick from Retribe, and joining us today is Judy Atkins, who's a curator at the Southwark Museum. Is that correct? At the Southwark Museum, or is it the Southwark Council?
The amazingly snappy title we chose was the Southwark Heritage Centre and Walworth Library. It just rolls off the tongue beautifully, but yeah, so I just call it Walworth. We're at Walworth.
Walworth. Judy, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned to you in our little chat before, I did study history at university, so I'm a bit of a, I don't know a lot, but I'm just very, very always interested in the history of London. And for some reason, Southwark has always had its real kind of, it's always tugged on my heart a little bit. I think because some of the things that I know about it is that Shakespeare used to hang out in Southwark, and it's kind of where he got inspiration for some of his darker plays. It was always known as kind of this den of iniquity, and I imagine some debauchery happened around that time. So I don't know, maybe in another life I hung out around Southwark. I'm really interested to know, who you are, what you do, some things that you can tell us about the area, and also, people who hear this, how they can kind of come down and see you and explore, the history and the archives of what Southwark has to offer, because it is such a beautiful and rich part of the city, isn't it?
Yeah, I really love it. And I know what you mean about being drawn to Southwark. It's a little bit of a strange one for me, because I'm originally from Scotland, and after a long journey, found myself in Southwark about 20 years ago, and I've really kind of left, really, and I'm finding it really difficult to let go of it. But yeah, it is an interesting and very, very, very rich place in so many different ways, and it's changed. It's a place that seems to have changed so much, especially at the moment with all the regeneration going on. Actually, that continuity has been the same for the past 2,000 years. I mean, it is recognized now, I think, as the Romans' first real suburb, if you like, a very important suburb of the city of Londinium way back in 50, 60 AD, and has gone through a real massive set of changes, and yet it stays very much rooted in its geographic, physical and rural and industrial place by the river. And those four elements have not really changed throughout the years. We've changed a bit, or we haven't, but Southwark's remained remarkably consistent in a lot of ways, even though it feels like we're now just one massive urban sprawl. There's still pockets of real beauty and peace and tranquility in the borough that feels really surprising, I think. And I think people value it for that. You get all sorts. You get the closeness to the city, if you want that. You get the closest to the river, if you want that. You get the route out of the city quite quickly, if you want that. It's a great borough. We always call it the most historic borough in London, but there's so many contenders for that. The city hates that. Westminster. It's probably Westminster, but Southwark is one of them. Let's put it out there.
So let's go into the geography, as you mentioned. With the Roman settlements, I believe that the reason why the bridge was there is because it was one of the easiest parts of the river to cross.
I believe so. So obviously the Thames was very different. It was a massive, wide, wet basin of marshland and sand and gravel, loads and loads of small islands that sometimes people think there was nobody here. They always think when the conquerors come, there's nobody there. And we know from many other countries that that's being greatly overturned in the last few decades in history. But there were plenty of people here. It was a trading basin in between the toplands and hills of this a bit further south. So it's a little scoop, which made it a great environment to trade, to fish, to hunt even. And the shallowest, narrowest bit happened to be a great place for a bridge. And so the Romans laid that down. I think they went into London, round the Thames into London first, and then put the bridge back the way when they established their garrison on the south side. And that's where we started as a kind of bridge crossing as Roman Southwark.
As you mentioned, there were people here before the Britons, and I don't know where I read this from, Judy, but it might have been at the London Museum. I'm not sure, you know, because it's more geared up for children, which is my mental capacity. But it said about the original Britons is as the Romans came in, they actually welcomed them. You know, for the first bit, it was like, hey, these people are here, let's welcome them. And that's always really kind of struck my heart as that whole idea of immigration, and we didn't know what was going to happen with the Romans and the conquering that they did. But it's kind of the innocence of the Britons that were there at the time, much like, say, the innocence of the indigenous populations of North America that welcomed, you know, the pilgrims coming over. And whenever I think about that, I always think about how, you know, immigration and people coming to an area being welcomed, it really does warm my heart, because I think immigration is a beautiful thing. And it feels too, even to this day, that the diversity in Southwark is just so beautiful. And with I don't know how to pronounce it, Murcio Metropolitano and the Elephant and Castle and just all these great places for people to come to and eat and just explore each other's cultures. So I know I just jumped 2,000 years, but is that true? The capacity of these people who were actually welcoming to the Romans?
Yes and no, but I think it's one of the interesting places about Southwark is its massive role in transition. People come into the borough and leave again and leave their traces, but there are communities that settle and leave their traces too. And I think being by this riverside, it's a place that looks outwards to the big trading nations of the world, and also brings a lot of people in. So because Southwark and South London are often the places where people settle because they're out of we're barred financially from and otherwise from settling in the richer places of North London. I think that was kind of, North Londoners may disagree, but I'm I'm neutral territory in that sense. But but it's also a sense where Southwark is a bit of an outlier. It's always, you know, the whole Only Fools and Horses thing was set in Peckham because Peckham was such an outrageous idea that Peckham was a place to set a sitcom, but not at all. The communities, again, those waves of people coming through from the road, from all over. The Belgics were probably the first ones before the Romans, in the late Iron Age, and then the Romans. And then all the tribes that were surrounding London at that time decided, led by Boudica famously, who burnt Southwark down, were not welcoming. So it was, but the Romans are an interesting empire case. They were really good integrating, and the advantages of becoming a Roman citizen, not that people like us on the outliers of the empire necessarily got that chance, but the advantages of being in the empire for many conquered lands seem to kind of outweigh some of the disadvantages. The famous Monty Python sketch of what did the Romans ever do for us rang true, but it did exist before, and there was lots of cultural exchange throughout Europe and wider, if archaeology is to be believed, long before they came along. So that they were ready, set up to accept a nation like that. I can't speak for how they felt about it, but what I do know is one of our sort of most famous Roman pieces in the exhibition in the Heritage Centre is called the Hunter God, a statue that was excavated from under Southwark Cathedral in the 1970s. And he dates, I think it's a he, dates from around 150 to 250 AD, and it is a blend of gods. So I think it's a he because there's a little bit the goddess Diana in there. There's Mithras, which is, people might know as a sort of local well, it's not such a local deity, but Mithras is a sort of non-Roman deity, I think. I'm going to get lots of letters about that one. Local gods as well, like Maponus, but also there's a bit of Apollo in there. There's a real mix of gods in that statue, and that possibly, the archaeologists suggest, that that is an attempt to assimilate Roman style, but made by local craftspeople. So at that point, in 150 to 250, you're surrounded less of the garrison, and it's more fine residences, temple systems, baths, theatres, amphitheatres, warehouses. They're really integrating and multicultural, I would say. But interesting program on YouTube last night looking at how multicultural and diverse the conquered peoples of Rome were, and what the Roman Empire swept up into its might, if you like. The answer is really quite a lot more diverse from all sort of corners of the world. So that was kind of a good grounding for Southwark, a place like Southwark, to be that transitional place. And the so-called Dark Ages, things fell apart slightly after 450, 460, when the Romans decamped and left. Who they were by that time, were they people that looked to Rome still, or were they Britons that had become Romanized and were a bit of both? Certainly, we went through a very quiet time for a few years, but a little later on, it became very, very much more feisty and embattled for the next sort of few hundred years, until we became the hunting pleasure grounds of royalty, really, and rural lands. But the Romans left their industry around the wharfs and jetties, and that we never lost that either.
So it was the Romans who started to manipulate the river, as you mentioned. It was marshland, right? So how did they control the flow?
I would say with archaeologists, I think that probably might have happened earlier, but certainly if you're looking at trying to navigate around the many gravel islands and other, all those rivulets, all those marshes, I would suggest peoples have known how to manipulate rivers for many, many thousands of years before that. But I think the Romans were the ones that probably hit the gold standard in actually bridging it again proper, well, for a solid, it was wooden, but it was a more solid effort than people had been able to before. And that's what made the difference. The stone one came along in the 13th century. And then bridging remained the only bridge crossing until the late 18th century, which is quite amazing, really, considering how used we are to thinking of it as a multi-bridge river. And it's such a barrier to so many people for so long. And, you know, sometimes it still is that part of London that over the river for South Londoners is still, you know, and it used to be, again, back in that, don't go south of the river. That's kind of a joke, both a joke but quite serious in lots of cultural attitudes till fairly recently, I would have said. Maybe it still exists. But yeah, I think the two halves of London are similar. And a place like the Elephant Castle, I remember doing an exhibition in 2010, I think it was, and it was of a local artist called Austin Osman Spare. Very, very interesting artist. And it enticed people from other parts of London and further, and they would get off shivering at Elephant and Castle. And we had to guide them into the museum, which was at that point in the Old Town Hall, on the base, the ground floor of the Old Town Hall. It was like, we've never come to South London before. It's like, well, here we are. And I think most people were pleasantly surprised, I hope.
It's funny. Yeah, especially if you support football teams too. There's a huge north and south. Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned Boudica and then the Romans decamping. I'm interested to know what was it that made the Romans, like you said, decamp and then start the new regimes?
Well, they got too big, as anyone who's interested in collapses of civilizations, a very interesting author called Jared Diamond, well worth reading. Guns, Germs and Steel is one of his really interesting works, especially these days. And wrote about the end of empires and civilizations, and they do end. And financially and politically, Rome itself collapsed, was invaded. They could no longer sustain the outer fringes of the empire, split political power, and it was over, in inverted commas, for it. It withdrew from Britain because, and started withdrawing further because they just couldn't sustain all the trouble that we Scots, I like to think it was we Scots, really drove them out. They never bothered, they couldn't, the legend has it they couldn't get any further than Hadrian's Wall, hence Hadrian's Wall. But I don't know so much. There's plenty of integrating going on around that border. But yeah, Britain became, why would you sustain this? You withdraw to the centre. They had enough trouble going on in the Western Mediterranean to distract them. Sorry, the Eastern Mediterranean to distract them, and it needed all their resources.
Yeah. And then, so how did once the Romans left, what happened to the area?
Well, good question. I think certainly it deteriorated. It may be loss of markets, or people decided that they didn't want to live in this way anymore, and everybody went back to farming their lands, and there was no market for their goods and chattels. I'm not so sure that's true. Again, you'd have to ask a real expert in that period after between the Romans and the Saxons. But it seemed that Southwark was left behind for a very long period of time, and maybe resorting to the tribal ways of life without the over gloss, if you like, of the empire. Was just, again, too much for people. They went back to their homelands, the Kent and Essex coastal regions and further. And London was left a little bit down at heel for quite a number of years after that, and then started picking up again as a centre of power a good several hundred years later. A couple of hundred years later. So it's not well mapped. We don't have a lot of in the museum collection, we don't have a lot, and I'd be interested to talk to Museum London about this, but I think that holds true for them. Material culture from that time, we've got tons of Roman stuff. We've got a very good Roman collection, especially Roman Southwark, because the local family that created the Cuming museum collection was passionately interested in Roman Southwark and had absolutely loads of it. The reason they got that chunk of stuff, interestingly, was because they were collecting from the early 1800s right up to the late 19th century. So it was 1806, bulk of it 1806 to 1890, 1900. And that was right through the period that London was being torn up for embanking the river, for making the railway lines, for cutting canals and riverways, for enclosing all the other riverways, for laying the roads, for building the houses that we see around us now. So turning London from Walworth well into the mid-19th century was quite rural, still surrounded by rural lands. But it was around the 1830s, 40s and 50s, it became a much more industrialized and residential area, and spread. It was just brick. By 1900, it was just brick as far as you could see. But the Cumings collected all that stuff because workmen and others would be digging all that stuff literally out of the ground as they were laying sewers, pipeworks, lines, tram lines, all those kinds of communication and transport things began to throw up so much archaeology that museums really began to take a huge haul of stuff in at that point. It was all the thrown away history of Roman and medieval and Tudor and 18th century London.
Yeah. Oh wow, what an intro! I just, as you were talking about how they enclosing the other rivers, cutting the canals, I could just imagine all of the work that was going on around that time.
Hmm.
But let's go. Let's say one of the buildings that I actually walked around the other day is Southwark Cathedral, and
Hmm.
it's a really interesting building because of the level that it sits at, and also I believe it wasn't touched by the fire, right? In
No.
yeah,
Well, it was
because it
you mean the big one, the
yeah, the
1666? Yeah,
1666,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It was the Prior of St Mary Overy at that point, obviously, because it didn't become a cathedral till much, 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 much later in its history. But yeah, it was the vantage point over to the fire. But you would have still got, I believe, there was still a little bit touched Southwark on the more where, if anyone's familiar with the riverfront, where Hayes Wharf, obviously prior to Hayes, hundreds of years prior to Hayes Wharf, but the wharves still get touched because you're getting fire bombs coming over from that all the time. So and imagining the people trying to escape from that south and east and west to try and get away from that devastation. Southwark, of course, had its own big fire. It's had a couple actually, and one of the ones where there was a massive fire in Tooley Street, which was quite devastating. But yeah, this was 1666 was definitely the biggest one, but it was the one most remembered. But it was an occupational hazard, and it revolutionized house building. Didn't revolutionize London quite as much as the plans to lay out a sort of Paris-style London hoped. So they still, Peter Ackroyd is a very interesting writer on this, and he says Southwark's a little bit the same, but certainly London, even after the fire, they were still building the same old pattern as they were before. So the medieval winding streets pattern remained, which is why we haven't got so many of the wide boulevards and vistas of, say, Berlin or Paris or anything like that, because they closed it all down again. People just poured in and built their buildings slightly off plan. So we've only got snippets of that fine building. But Southwark at that time was a fringe of activity around the river side. You've mentioned Shakespeare earlier, and the theatres and the entertainment centre around the bankside for sure. And then further south, you're meeting the orchards and rural fields and farmlands of leafy Camberwell, rural Peckham,
Wow, yeah,
and the rolling vistas of Dulwich and beyond. And that took, again, another several hundred years before that became changed from a series of villages to a solid, joined up urban landscape. So, but it did happen, obviously it did start to happen when they started laying the roads down properly, toll roads at first in the 18th century, and then we went on from there. So that it had the land, it was cheap land for building. They had filled London. One of the reasons, of course, why we had so many theatres around the bankside is because of the incredible restrictions that the City of London put on building theatres, and that didn't allow any more in their patch. So they went south. Shakespeare went south and others to find cheap building land and established businesses there. But also there was a bit of a moral one where they didn't want those kinds of activities besmirching the City of London. Too late in many cases, because it was already a hotbed of vice. But Southwark, slightly, it's always picked up a lot as North Southwark's history as a den of iniquity. But yeah, look, it is fun. It is a fun thing to think about. But there was obviously a lot more to the borough than that. But yeah, it was a lot of liveliness, a little too much for many people. And obviously that added to that is the tradition of the quite wild fairs and things, which, I mean, Camberwell Fair was part of that. Southwark Fair itself, the Frost Fairs, as well as all that was theatres. Bear baiting and animal baiting, unfortunately, were also part of that. Made lots of money, controversially, for the churches whose land a lot of it was. And one amazing, if you ever get a chance to go up to Borough, there's the Crossbones churchyard as well, which shouldn't be forgotten about the many women, particularly, who were part of that trade, part of that landscape of entertainment for people, who plied their trade willingly or unwillingly around that area, funded by or to the benefit of rich landowners. And that's a thing that doesn't change either.
No, it doesn't. There's one thing, the history of London Bridge I'm really interested in, because I don't know all of it. I know that, when I went around the cathedral the other day, it shows where the last bridge was, where the last, it marks it out. But can you kind of give us a brief history of the bridge and the evolution of that bridge and how it is to where it is today, which is that kind of thing that's everyone mistakes Tower Bridge for?
Well, what we see today is the Rennie's Bridge. The Rennie, John Rennie is sort of a well-recognised, famed Southwark engineer, if you want to call him that. But yeah, there's several iterations of the bridge. So we've dropped in the kind of bridge history. So yeah, obviously we've got the Roman throw across, said to be obviously would be wooden, survived, patched up for many years, and then the stone one in the 13th century, I think it's 1290, sets the tone, which is elaborated for the next few hundred years and built on. Several famous pictures show London Bridge completely built up. You would have walked through that tunnelway, surrounded by houses on both sides, houses and businesses, right into North London and back again. And the bridge is one of the reasons why Southwark is as it is, because such a narrow walkway, incredibly congested. Southwark and the bridge has this relationship which basically created all that Southwark is today. Because you had to wait, you had to queue, you had to wait your turn. Sometimes this could take an extremely long time. And so what did you do on the other side of the bridge, on the south side, waiting for your turn? You went to the inns, hence Borough High Street is full of medieval inns, was traces of which are still there. You went drinking, gambling, entertainment. You went to the market. The early days of Borough Market grew up because there's a good trading opportunity with all these people hanging around, having made the onerous journey from the south and east coasts, the Kent Road, the Dover Road. They have to hang around and wait somewhere. And that's what the bridge served as an emblem of that start of a whole service industry, really. Without that, or with a bigger bridge, you wouldn't have had so much of that. If it had been 3 times the width and allowed foot traffic and cart traffic and animal traffic to flow easily, then possibly North London would have got all of that benefit, and South London, you'd have just been a transitionary place. But the entertainment side, the residential need to be around that area, lining those ribbon development roads right down to the further reaches of Dulwich and Sydenham, was what grew the borough. So then you decide to replace that bridge. It fell into decay. Tudor times was already complaining about how awful it was. It must have been awful. It also affected the flow of the river, because one of the things that we're not so used to today is we see a smooth flowing river. But the bridge itself, which was built on those massive, great boat-shaped platforms, affected the river flow so much that it was practically rapids at several points.
Mm.
So you needed watermen and lightermen to take you across the river. If you couldn't get on the bridge, you paid someone to take you across, because it was extremely dangerous to cross. And river traffic was a risky but quick way of doing it. Wealthier people would do almost anything to avoid getting caught up in that sort of vice-ridden, congested, pickpocketed den of annoyance on the bridge itself. So would pay a whole industry of people to get you across quickly and safely. And they were like the sort of, I imagine them as sort of the black taxi drivers of today, sort of a roguish lot, but brave and skilled, and able to get you from A to B without killing you very often.
Yeah.
But yeah, but the bridge itself only calmed down really with the new bridges. They took that bridge apart, famously sold it on, and the wider bridge with its wider spandrels allowed more flow. And a whole industry, it still clung on in the 19th century, but the wider, flatter bridge with no encumbrances meant a much easier route into London and out again. So it changed again. It made it an influence on Southwark. It made Southwark maybe a calmer, grander borough at that end of the bridge. And yeah, so that's the one we've got today. And I think it's immortalised in Dickens because, of course, that would have been the bridge that Dickens would have crossed to come into Southwark. He spent quite a bit of time in Southwark. He was a writer that loved to walk around at night, famously, but walked everywhere. His sort of Georgian childhood, partly in Southwark, he lodged in Lance Street, just up Borough High Street, because his parents were in the Marshalsea prison for debt. At least his father ran into debt. And at that time, the borough, from Borough to Elephant, which would have been Newington Butts at that point. Still Elephant Castle existed, but Newington Butts was the region. Would have been in the 18th and 19th centuries quite famous for its prisons. Infamous in a way, but they weren't as bad as the North London prisons, Tyburn and Newgate. Dreadful places. But King's Bench, Marshalsea, and others, which still exist in the street names, and one wall. We've got one wall left of Marshalsea prison. Were largely debtor prisons, and I think Marshalsea certainly was a massive debtor prison. Quite interestingly, that if the person charged with debt went into prison, they often took their whole families with them, which is why Dickens' mother and a couple of his siblings also lived in the Marshalsea prison. I believe it was at that point they were day prisoners or night prisoners, so you could be let out during the day, like day release, and then were locked up at night. And I think that was the case for the Dickens family. I think Dickens was it changed him. Obviously, he had to go out to work. He'd already missed out so much schooling because, interestingly, they prioritised his sister's schooling, which was quite unusual for the time. And I had to take up work in a blacking factory, making book blacking over the river. I used to have to walk to visit his parents back and forward for hours, and both hated it and also it kind of brought out the author in him, because Borough High Street was just a crazy place at that point, crazy busy, crazy, full of all kinds of people, and that's kind of inspiring his stories. Some of the darker stories as well, obviously Jacob's Island over Bermondsey, where Dock Road is at the moment. Was notorious slums at that point, so that was growing away from the fine residences and the wide boulevards and entertainment places into a crowded, slum-ridden, challenging place to live in parts. And I think same is true for quite a lot of Victorian history, but we like to think of the dim and dingy. There were still fine residents. Walworth was still quite a nice place to live. That's where the Cumings had their house, just off Manor Place, and at the point as well that was surrounded by gardens and parklands, which were beginning to emerge to get away from those built-up slums. Walworth itself had its own zoo and fine gardens, 15 acres just off the Walworth Road, full of exotic animals and plants, which is hard to imagine now, but it was quite a thing in its day, and relatively common, very, very popular. And we have very few artifacts surviving from the zoo. We have the giraffe in the exhibition in the Heritage Centre, which is one of the few souvenirs I know of. There must have been loads, but the physical ones got loads of paper, however, because the Cumings lived right outside the gates of the zoo and collected all the tickets and playbills. And they're a huge laugh, a great insight into 19th century idea of what's entertaining. Not always very comfortable. But Walworth, particularly Elephant and Walworth, were renowned centres of learning. Really, there was such a vibrant part of the world. Walworth. It had the Walworth. I want to say Walworth Society. That's a newer wonderful entity. It still exists, but there were all sorts of collectors and places of learning, small exhibitions. There were other museums around, and you can just see a tiny trace of that in some of the buildings that still exist there in Walworth Road. Some of those are still there behind the shop fronts. Such a lot that exists when you go off the beaten track and look behind the modern fronts. It's quite amazing.
I'd love a tour around there one day. How come Elephant and Castle got the name Elephant and Castle?
Oh boy, so this is the thorny one, isn't it? So there's lots of different ones, rumours and tales, which is fascinating in itself. So it was ostensibly named after a pub called the Elephant Castle, which was a very old watering hole drinking establishment, because it was in the crux of several roads coming together at some point. So you got the road, obviously famously Old Kent Road, Newington Butts, Elephant, and down to New Cross and over to Vauxhall. So Elephant was a meeting point for that. Okay. For many was. But how did that pub get its name? That may be to do with the emblem of my colleagues are going to be shouting at the radio because I can't remember the title of it. It's emblem of a company that had its the elephant and the castle, the platform that it stood on as its emblem. Okay. And that is, so it's a very ancient emblem. And there's also other tales that it was a mispronunciation of the Infanta de Castile. That's a famous one, but it isn't. I think we all those historical societies have banded together and scotched that one. Okay. There's suggestion that because there was a zoo around that area, that it might be to do with the elephants there, but the Elephant and Castle name predates that by some distance. So, but that's not to say that there weren't, as there were for hundreds of years from the medieval fairs onwards, plenty of exotic animals being travelled round places like that. But I think it was more to do with that company, which I've had a mind blank on. I can always email it into you when I
definitely look it up and send it to me.
The original company that had that as its emblem, and it's that section of road down to especially down to the Kent Road is such an ancient thoroughfare that it's a whole trace of history in its own.
Yeah.
The old the Kent Road, the Thomas à Becket Shrine, right up to the creation of Burgess Park and Sir George Livesey, the gas towers and the Metropolitan Borough and the libraries, and it's such an incredibly interesting, and the Surrey Canal cutting across it. It's such an interesting stretch of the world there as well, parallel to the Walworth Road. But a fascinating journey in its own right, and it got lost a bit in the south end of Old Kent Road because of I think the warehousing in between, the park and say down to B&Q and a bit further down is, it's a bit of a mishmash. It's been a bit of a warehouse land for a long time, which is vital. I mean, it was one, just off Old Kent Road was one of the biggest. I rented a house there where it was once on top of one of the biggest railway interchanges in South London. It's the Elephant Bricklayers Arms Goods Yard. And the railways cut through, made it cut through that, made a huge difference. But there was hundreds of lines meeting at that point as well. Stations that are now long gone as well. So a fascinating journey down there. We need a longer tour to get down.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Even just the Elephant, even just the Old Kent Road itself.
There's the term larking about when people say so, is this true that it comes from? There's the pub called the Mudlark down by London Bridge, and it's a mudlark, wasn't it? When they used children to go out into the Thames when the tide was out to. Yeah,
well. I kind of collect quite a few books on obscure occupations, and there are hundreds of really nasty ones in the 18th and 19th centuries, and mudlarking was one of them. So yeah, larking and mudlarking. It's very popular at the moment. There's quite a few interesting books and blogs and YouTube videos out on mudlarking. I do believe at certain stages you do have to have a license to go down there. So I don't think you can just. There are certain parts you can't just pop down to the foreshore, but in plenty of other places, you can still uncover quite a lot of the stuff that London threw into the river and spent the best part of several hundred, 200 or 300 years throwing their detritus into the river, which still comes up today, and people are still finding things. Mudlarkers were just about the poorest class of children that you could get. At the other end of the spectrum, you had the pure pickers, and you also would get maybe children doing this as well. Occupations for nimble fingers, very dangerous, avoiding the tides, the sucking mud, stench, the disease that you would pick up down there. Sounds like a laugh today, but it really wasn't. You were desperate, but they were picking up all of that detritus that they could get their hands on and selling it on as scrap, but everything you can think of. Bones went for the bone meal, to the glue factories, scraps of leather, anything metal, obviously, so that still holds today. Anything metal obviously is quite valuable, still is. Anything that you could possibly pick up, and they were looking for the same things that we feel fun today. You're always going to find that bit of treasure, hoping that somebody's dropped a coin, lost their pocket watch over the edge of the bridge,
thrown away engagement rings, just thrown away.
Oh, the hope. It's like, especially around the bridges. But but you're getting all sorts of other things washed down across around that bridge as well, which are less salubrious, and they also pick those up as well.
Judy, I told you 45 minutes would fly by, and we didn't really get into the what your job is today, and the archives and the places that people can come and visit if they want to learn more about things that we've talked about today. Can you
sure. So many people listening might remember the old Cuming Museum, which was in the Newington Public Library and then spent up to 2013, its time also in the old town, the former town hall on Walworth Road. In 2013, there was a fire, unfortunately, in the building. The Cuming Museum collection and the archives that were also stored in those buildings were fortunately saved. But we've been in store without being able to get back into a building for all that time, since 2013. In 2018, because of the redevelopment, space became available for a new library for Walworth, to replace the old Newington Library, and for the collection. It was never going to be a huge space, so the idea was to blend it together as a showcase of the best of the Cuming collection. Well, it's arguable. I love it all, but a snapshot of the Cuming collection and Southwark's history. More modern archival material and films, artworks. We've got an extensive art collection as well of local borough scenes. And just really, although it is in terms of footprint not much different from what we had, it's spread around the library and blended into that in lots and lots. There's 32 cases altogether, plus a pocket history, a pocket-sized history of the borough itself, and the Cuming collection, which is a worldwide collection, so it touches on every continent, because they were fascinated by the international culture, and they collected a lot of it, which we're still in touch with many Indigenous communities today where that came from. So we're very open to the world in that sense. It's very unusual to have that kind of collection looked after by a local authority on behalf of the residents of the borough. So the library is fully open, fully functional. COVID's made a difference. Obviously, we would have normally by now had a full programme of events, but that will be coming along in September. And then subsequently, we're just kind of like everybody else, I think, playing it a bit by ear. But you can come in, you can browse around. You're very welcome to do so. We're not too much restrictive on that. People are enabled to make a choice about how they want to come in or not. But from autumn, I think we'll see a big difference in people wanting to come and take part in our events. There will be curator tours. There will be lots and lots of things to do. We've done a few things outside, like archaeological dig boxes and walking tours and things like that. Me and my colleagues in Southwark Archives. If you want to see family history and paper documents of the borough, that's my sister organisation, if you like. So we're the same team, but they're up at John Harvard. So you can come to the Heritage Centre in Walworth Road and ask us questions for sure. But if you want to do family research or anything like that, you might have to wait till October, when John Harvard Library hopefully will be reopened, because it's being refurbished. It's an important point to clarify, because we've got a lot of people expecting to come and research their family history here. But this is a museum exhibition, and as time goes on, will be a more interactive space. We hope to also offer volunteering for people who are interested in heritage. We've got a workroom, we've got meeting rooms, we've got event space, there's a children's library, and so all the normal things that you might find in a museum, and certainly a fully functioning library, are coming on stream very shortly.
Beautiful. I will make sure that I book a visit. I want to come down and also maybe try to get your advice on some tours, some walking tours, because I'd like to take part in one of those. Yeah.
We'll keep in touch, because I think we'll be publishing. We didn't want to do it so much at the moment, but the opening hours are 10 till 6 every day at the moment, 10 till 5 on Saturdays. And from September, hopefully, unless things change, it'll be 10 till 8.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining me, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was really awesome. I learned so much, and we could have probably talked for twice this easily, because I have way more questions that I wanted to ask you, but we'll get you on again one day. Yeah. Okay.
Brilliant. Great to
Thank you so much for joining. Thanks everybody at the What's on Elephant Castle Facebook page. Don't forget, you can join me this Thursday at 11 a.m. for another Tough and Tender guided workshop. Okay, so we'll see you then. Thanks everybody, and thanks again, Judy. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye now.
Bye.